Namaste. Welcome to Inspiring Women. Inspiring Women is a TV show where we bring women leaders from all around the globe and share their success stories. Today we have with us Miss Saudamini Siegrist. She is a playwright and a poet. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Could you tell us your story about how you got started as a poet?
My mother read poetry to us, so I had an early exposure. But it wasn't until maybe second grade I wrote my first poem. It was a haiku. I was so addicted to the thought of being able to create words in that way. But then I can say that I became serious about writing when I was a teenager, about 15, when I lost my oldest brother, who was a writer. And his journal became my Bible. So I wanted to be a writer in that way, that he also was a social activist and an anti-war activist and so on. So there was a whole stream of consciousness that came at me full throttle. And then, but the actual, embarking on poetry, it came also a little bit later, when I was working remotely with another writer who was advising me. I was writing a novel, and interestingly enough, she suggested I should be also working on poetry. And I sent some poems that I had been working on, and she remarked that it would be better if I went back to the novel. But I was bit. I had been bitten. And from that day and from that time, poetry was really my world. So it has been that journey from the beginning, and also with these various, let's say, landmarks of life that steer us in ways that we don't always realize at the time or expect or suspect, but then in looking back in reflection we can see that direction taking root in our hearts. So
does writing energize you, or does writing exhaust you?
Energizes me, but I would just challenge that notion, because in a way our energy and our exhaustion feed one another. So as there's a line in one poem I have where emptying the ocean from my heart and filling it again. So the emptying is that kind of exhaust in which we spill ourselves, and then we have to inhale. So that breath, our inhalation, our exhalation, so there is energy, there is exhaustion. But overall, with the intent of your question, it's an energizing force in my life, and it is indeed my life force.
Could you tell us what you think are the common traps for aspiring writers?
There has been a tendency about the anxiety of influence. Harold Bloom is my reference here. So that is actually, I think, a valid point, that our influences can at times become a trap if we become derivative toward the authors or writers that inspire us. In my case, I didn't find that. That hasn't been a trap for me, not in my own perception of it. Rather, because many of the writers who have inspired me, and they are, what you could call the great writers, if you will, but where I get my biggest or greatest inspiration is not always where I find myself influenced in my own writing. I think that our influences they're tremendously significant and can become also a crutch.
So there's this image of poets being overcome with inspiration and writing something.
Yes, it has that power. I mean, there is, in my own opinion, but also experience, the creative force that informs all of us and literally in which we live. There are times when I've written something that I would consider almost spontaneous, as a kind of eruption, which requires very little editing or, let's say, reworking. But I often work on a poem for a very long time, even though it may come with powerful spurts and really unleash itself in a way that could be almost more than I would want or be able to receive. But then it's the beginning of something that becomes a process of writing, which can be almost endless in the finishing of the poem.
You've been planning to write this book, poetry book, titled America and the Glass Slipper, and you've also been planning to make a video book out of it. Can you tell us something about your book and why you decided to turn it also into a video book?
I have to say it did come from inside, that I felt, okay, now I have to pull, as difficult as it is, to pull together into one body, into one manuscript. I need to do that. I felt that that came as a compelling, command. Then, how does one do that? What does that mean? In my case, I didn't write a book of poetry, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. It just didn't, I don't have a thematic thread. The thread is just something very, at times broken. At times it becomes lost. And then I have to find it again, and it doesn't always fit into one narrative. So the narrative now, this idea of having narrative poetry as well has become not only popular, but also an important way of discovering our collective narrative voices. But in my case, it comes in more fits and starts. So now I'm working on collecting these poems into what could be called a manuscript, what I hope to publish as a book. And that I will, that to me is what I would like to consider to be the life offering that I have. And for me, it's the purpose of my being here. It's perhaps the only one purpose that I can finally fully take hold of.
In your opinion, do you think that there is a distinct female and male sensibility? Is poetry gendered or is it raced?
I think it is both. So it is yes and no. But it has been a very difficult question for me as a woman writer. Because when I was a young teenager, let's say, even before, as I mentioned, I already recognized that the writers I was being given, and those writers that I was instructed to read, were by and large male. And that was a hard truth. I didn't find myself in the reflection of the authorship, of the canon of literature that I was being taught. I developed a kind of resistance to the idea of gendered authorship. And I think I've come full circle. I'd like to say that. If it's true, I don't know. But I would say that I now feel a full embrace of my own experience as a writer, because I will not distinguish, and as a woman writer. Because indeed, my poetry and also my other writings are steeped with the experience and the reality of my gender, of the fact that I'm a woman and I write. So it's important. And so I don't want to take a step back from that, but rather I'd like to, fully embrace that, fully acknowledge and try to take that trajectory as far as it ultimately can go in my own personal experience and writing. About race, yes, of course, definitely, and I think that the diversity of authorship has been in resurgence, and that's a very good thing. It's a very important thing. Ultimately, each of us we write what we know, and so that brings our common human experience into a larger truth.
Do you view writing as a kind of spiritual practice?
Yes, I do. It's also physical, mental, vital, psychological, and in my case, I would also say psychic. So it is all of that. And I wouldn't say this is a spiritual poem, this is not, no. All of what we do, all of what we write is part of that journey, and it is also informed by our experience of, call it spirituality.
Could you tell us what writers you enjoyed reading as a child?
From my earliest memory, I was an obsessive compulsive reader. I just read everything I could get my hands on. And I had older brothers and an older sister, so I could grab a hold of whatever came my way. I think maybe the only book I remember not devouring as a little girl was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I think I closed the cover on that book after about 10 pages or so, because I felt that I wanted a different picture of what it meant to be a woman, a girl in the world, even at that age. And maybe I was a little bit Proustian, you could say, hiding under the covers with my flashlight. I was always being dragged to dinner. I had to read one more page. So I've been a reader from the get-go.
Can you tell us about your process of writing a new poem? Is it something that you do consciously or something that you find yourself doing spontaneously?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Because writing is a discipline. I don't need to admit that because I embrace that. It is a discipline, and that's something that I find tremendous strength in. But there's also something tremendously spontaneous, and that has been, in some ways, the trigger of some of what I consider to be the most important poems for me. I mean, after all, I would say that consciousness itself is spontaneous, and so we're always a bit inside out and outside in. So I look to inspiration from the world, where I feel very much excited by what I encounter. But sometimes also it comes from something else, from something that is not connected in the outer world. And it comes from an inner experience, you could say, or some emotional, or I would say psychic trigger.
How important is the sound or the music of the poem to you? Does it play an important part in your writing process?
Music. Extremely important. By that I mean the sound, the vibration, and the rhythm of the poem. There is something in the modern poetry, let's say, critique, that the idea that a poem would be a song, that there is this link with music, I think is sometimes misunderstood. Because indeed, all of the sound that we create, all of what we hear has a beat, it has a rhythm. And that's where the power of poetry exerts itself. And I think that beat, that heartbeat, that breath, that life force that comes in our energy, that it is a kind of music. But that I don't actually set my poems to music, by the way. But I feel that rhythm and that the beat of the verse is absolutely essential. It is an origin of writing for me.
Has your idea of writing poetry changed since you've started writing poems to where you are today?
Yes, it has. I think that is inevitable. I mean, it's an evolving experience. And it is also changing in the way that poetry is written and received more widely. That, I think, can be envisioned in a number of ways.
You have a very beautiful way of writing poems. The way you weave your words together, it's very interesting and it's very attractive to the readers to read. So could you tell us what your poems have in common? Is there any element that your poems do have in common?
I do actually trend toward alliteration and rhythm, and also a kind of, it's been called different things, internal rhyme, different rhyme schemes that come together in a very forceful way at times in certain poems, which is maybe not attractive to all readers, and perhaps it's a weakness. Let it be. It is the way that I write. And I personally get a tremendous energy from that sound, which I think has almost a ringing and at times a kind of seed sound. In one of the bee poems, a mantric, unstruck mantric sound. That, I think, is one characteristic of the poetry that I write. Not always, but it does tend to, emerge. It comes, with the poem. So that's one commonality, you could say. But if I were to say what is the common thread, the thing that brings the poems together, again, I would go back to saying it's that psychic strike. Because My name, Saudamini, it means lightning, and I have a great love of lightning. I spent 3 summers on a lookout tower watching lightning. You know, it's something that I love, that flash, the small spitfire flame. That's another poem. So I think poetry works like that. We stand in a field and we're struck, but we also strike back. So the poem becomes that igniting power, the creative power of our own self, our own voice. So a poem has to, in my sense or in my experience, it has to have that. And it can be, again, it can be manifested in many different ways. But I also would say that some poems that I write, I mentioned a little bit before, they come with a more sudden gust. And others work very slowly. They may take months, years even, for their full flower, their full-bodied volume to be heard. And that's something that I think it speaks to the truth of the poem. There is, in my experience, there is a deep connection with, let's say, truth and beauty. So that's a cliche, but it's something that I think also we experience.
Lastly, is there anything that we missed out asking that you'd like to tell our viewers?
I think my final word on that is, you know, I feel that we all have that. We have that limitless creative force. And that's how we, I think, live most fully in whatever way, in however we express ourselves. No, it was really my pleasure and my honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and you know, all power to you in your own life, in your own work, and what you're doing. It's great.